Good evening. How are you all doing? Thanks very much for coming here. And I'm very pleased to see these large crowds again. We fill the room now every time for one of our guest speakers. So thanks very much for coming. I would like to welcome you to yet another event in our KRASNO event series here at UNC-Chapel Hill. And I should add, sunny Chapel Hill once again. I'm Klaus Larres. I'm the Richard M. KRASNO Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Before I introduce our guest speaker today, I would like to mention to you that we have uploaded all our previous events on our YouTube channel, so the videos are ready for you to watch. And I know many of you have been waiting for that. You can't wait, so to speak. So please check out our YouTube channel, youtube.com/KRASNOUNC. And it's a particular pleasure to welcome Professor Antony Hopkins today. Professor Hopkins is Emeritus Smuts Professor of Commonwealth Studies at the University of Cambridge in the UK. And between 1994 and 2002, he was the active Smuts Professor in Commonwealth Studies at Cambridge. And after that, he also was a professor at the University of Texas in Austin. He has many distinctions to his name. He's one of the leading scholars of contemporary history, of empire studies in the world. He has done a lot of work on the economic history of Africa. He has done a lot of work on globalization, on British and European colonialism. And now, of course, he has written that huge book on the American empire, which I would like to show to you. Professor Hopkins said, many people admire it, but most people say it's daunting. And I guess there's some truth to that, you know. It probably would take me longer to read it than it took you to write it. But it's a massive book, and it, of course, is on sale outside. And Tony Hopkins is more than pleased to sign it for you if you decide to buy a copy. As you know, on the flyer it said that Emeritus Professor Michael Hunt would be here to respond to Professor Hopkins' talk. Unfortunately, Professor Hunt has been taken ill. We wish him, of course, a speedy recovery, but he cannot be here today. Therefore, I will ask a few questions after your talk, and then we will open it up to questions from you, the audience. And today, Professor Antony Hopkins will talk about, was there ever an American empire? That is, of course, a question which concerns us all, not least now, but also in the distant past, like the 19th century. So we will hear about the American empire, both in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and really also what is going on today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Antony Hopkins to the KRASNO event series here at UNC-Chapel Hill.
Good afternoon, everybody, and I must echo the thanks that were given by Klaus to your presence today. The sun will indeed be tempting. However, I'm an experienced lecturer, so I have taken care to lock the doors. This is indeed my first visit to this campus, and it is a great pleasure to be here. I say that not as a formality, but, and here I must interpose because I'm not counting the 35 minutes in these few opening remarks that I have been allocated, comma. It is something I wish to say about my presence here today. We all know that academics are noted for their competitiveness, a competitiveness that can become so narrow as to defeat all the original objectives of searching for truth and can often finish up in a clash of personalities. There is happily another side to the academic life, which somebody of my age becomes familiar with simply through the elapse of the decades, and that is collegiality. And my visit here has, can you not hear me through the mic, by the way? Can you hear me okay? In the cheap seats, can you hear me? It's all right, good. Thank you very much. So the collegiality of scholarship is something that one acquires with time through connections and various debts and so on, and cherishes as that time passes and becomes itself history. And on this occasion, as Klaus said, I had hoped very much to meet Michael Hunt and another great scholar, Luis Perez, who may or may not be available or even here today. And I wanted to do that in order to express my appreciation to two scholars I have never met, of their great contribution and their influence on my own work. But there is a third name, that of Klaus Larres, that I wish to mention now, because we've never met before, and he took on the task of organizing this visit. Those of you who have never done this, and I see from the lack of lines on your faces that I'm speaking to the majority, nay, to everybody, that have no idea of the amount of work and emails and time and trouble involved. And Klaus has been unremitting in his dedication, to the point of meeting me at the airport on top of dozens of emails to make sure that this evening would go as well as my own level of competence would permit. And with those opening remarks, you may now put the stopwatch on. Not quite. I just wish to say that for me to speak for 35 minutes is going to be an assault on my record, which will be unprecedented. A book of 1,000 pages to be summarized. I really asked for 3 hours, which I know you would really have wanted, but 35 minutes it will be. The penalty will be, the pleasure for you will be, there is an estimated arrival time, we should make it. The downside, of course, is that this scamper through the centuries is going to be even more superficial than it would have been had I had the time I wanted. So that, of course, for any scholar who buries his head in detail is a kind of agony to extract even more superficiality from what is already a set of outrageous generalizations. So, if I slur my words after 10 or 20 minutes, you'll understand it's taken me a bottle and a half of whiskey to be able to try and even attempt this. And I will be quite happy, but tomorrow, of course, I will pay the penalty with my headache. So what I want to do is to really just give you a set of signposts. I can't do any more than that, and you won't expect it in the time, to what I've attempted to argue in my book. What I've done is to put together a synthesis on the backs of many, many other superb scholars, perhaps mangling their work, but anyway, turning it to my purpose, to try to offer a fresh view of US international history over the last 3 centuries. And the aim of the book is to show that the US has been part of an imperial system during that time. I'm not going to define any terms, by the way. You can ask me about them. I can't pause long enough. I just do want to say I use the word imperial in a completely non-ideological sense. Let's say whether it's good or bad is indifferent from my argument, which is to show the importance of the imperial presence through the world. There are 3 building blocks to my argument. One is the history of globalization. Now, it may be obvious to you that we all know about this subject now because it's been mandatory in PhDs, articles, and books for about 7, 8, 10 years at least. The curious thing is that despite historians' belated interest in a subject spurred by other social scientists, we historians have yet to develop a profound historiographical debate about whether there were phases of globalization or not, and if they were, what were they, and how are they to be distinguished one from another? And I've tried to do that. The second building block is to suggest that there's a form of dialectic working in the transfer of one phase to another. That is to say, very simply, that the forces which generate one phase by their very success, create the forces which will eventually, if not overturn, transform the first phase. And finally, the third building block is the assumption no, let me dignify that. The argument that during the past 3 centuries, empires, by which I mean territorial empires, you must hold on to that because it influences a lot of what I have to say and our understanding of the present. Territorial empires were the prime agents of globalization. There were many other forms, of course, but they were the prime agents. Now, with these 3 things articulated, I've tried to draw the United States into what I'll call the mainstream, as part of the mainstream of Western development during this period. The first phase is what I've called unglamorously proto-globalization. I refer to the period essentially the 17th and 18th centuries, and specifically to the rise of what the books now call the military fiscal state, to refer to this late 18th century time as being a kind of high point, not a terminal point, but a high point of the development of proto-globalization, which was characterized by predominantly agricultural, rural economies and societies, advanced commerce, and dynastic states, very largely. Think about Europe during that time, and that's what you're discussing. And these states were moving towards, to the extent they could, forms of centralization based essentially on the well-known gunpowder revolution of the 16th century, which put new demands on states to gather taxes, to manage a greater coercive power, and conversely, to defend themselves from it. So with this concept in mind, I've then looked at what I'm calling a crisis of the military fiscal state in the late 18th century through the series of revolutions in Europe and, of course, in the United States that we know so well. And the political dimensions of what I've presented as being a kind of economic crisis were also manifest and significant, because across the world, across the Western world, you have clear examples of political protest, of new reformist demands for accountability, transparency, and so on. This is as true in mainland Britain as it was familiar to you from the history of the mainland colonies in the late 18th century. The American Revolution, then, is, in my view, an example of the dialectic I mentioned at the outset in action. That is to say, it wasn't the failure of a military fiscal state, but its success. Britain had reached, in the mainland colonies, the extent, the limit of its ability technologically to manage what it had formerly controlled. Adam Smith saw this and commented on it very memorably. Burke, I must give you one quotation, just to show that I do have my feet occasionally on the ground when, by mistake, I enter the archives and decide to linger. Here is Burke in 1774. "No contrivance can prevent the effect of distance in weakening government. In large bodies, the circulation of power must be less vigorous at the extremities." So there's a technological problem for controlling this empire. And then, in addition to that, of course, in the case of the mainland colonies, 2 other considerations have to be put in place. One, the rapid expansion of population during the 18th century. And secondly, we know from the work of quantitative historians, an increase in per capita income. The mainland colonies were getting more populous and also wealthier. And what happened, the story is pretty well known. What happened, of course, is that the fiscal crisis of the late 18th century, essentially these states expending more in military expenditure than they were gathering in revenues, led to a crunch for these empires. What we do know, this is more than just a question of taxation without representation. The story goes to the heart of the evolution and limits of these military fiscal states. After the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63, the debt in Britain was enormous. And what we now know, and I here throw in very quickly the work of two wonderful young scholars, one just published, the other coming out at the end of the year, which I have borrowed, as I have done throughout my career, but in this case, I actually gave them acknowledgement, so they're very fortunate. They have actually re-examined the politics of what was going on in London to try to deal with this financial problem, and they've come up in a complementary work with a very neat division between the conservative wing of the political spectrum, which wanted to go for an extractive empire. These people are our subjects, let's get the taxes out of them. And on the other hand, a progressive wing of the Whigs led by Pitt, who wanted to create an empire of trade and raise taxes through increasing trade. You see in those two views something that is actually can be seen going right through the 19th and 20th centuries, certainly in terms of colonial policy. Burke had a very nice phrase for this. He knew that something new was happening. He called it the new colony system that Grenville and Lord North and so on were trying to impose in the 1760s. And there's a global dimension to this too, because they tried this policy in India first of all, and by rejigging, there's a lot of internal political maneuvering, they changed the director of the East India Company. He was somebody who was prepared to go for an extractive empire. They captured the treasury of the Nawab of Bengal. It all looked good. But then again, military expenditure in India outran expenses. The British government had more or less to take over the East India Company, at least to the extent of seeing its finances all right. So there was nowhere left to go except to come back to the mainland colonies and put the screws on the colonists. So the story is a familiar one in some ways, but what I've tried to do is to pursue the depths of it into the structure of the states concerned and to draw out in greater detail this global aspect of the consequences of building a major empire. Now, after 1783, if we can scramble through to that magical date, there is a parting of the ways in the literature. And it's a parting of the ways that is both understandable and odd. It's understandable because every ex-colony wants to write its own history. From Nigeria to New Zealand, but now we can say beginning with the United States and going on to the new Latin American republics, of course, in the 19th century, this process was taking place. And of course, if you look at your textbooks right to today, you will find that from 1783 onwards, with one or two exceptions, but basically down to 1941, the story is that of a self-contained insular world, a large one, of course, large part of a continent indeed, and that the rise or the attempt to achieve liberty and democracy with setbacks and so on. That's the story. This is odd because when you look at this period and the achievement of formal independence from the point of view of somebody who knows about empires, you don't see the evolution in that way. You make the specialists on decolonization make a distinction between formal independence, changing the flag, changing the anthem, things like that, and effective independence. What was window dressing and what was the reality of the achievement or recapturing of sovereignty? And when you inquire into the second question, the answer is nearly always one that draws out for a period of time the long continuities which still survive the formal revolution. And this is especially the case with all settler societies, whether it's Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc., South Africa, because, of course, South Africa's a partial exception because of the Dutch settlers. But anyway, settler societies, white settler societies, in their origins anyway, of course, have come from the so-called home country. It is much more difficult for them to create what the books call a counterculture because their culture is derived They don't have an antonym. They don't have an alternative other than the home country. Much easier for Nigerians, of course, harder for white settler countries. So what I've done after 1783 is to suggest that the empire story doesn't stop there. Now, I should attribute a bit of blame to the imperial historians, who are otherwise, of course, entirely blameless, because they go along with this division of labor after 1783. Why? Well, of course, they're exhausted. They're a bit damaged by the defeat and surrender at Yorktown. There's a lot of kind of face-saving to be done. And more significantly, of course, they're galloping across India. They're finding Australia. They're fighting the French, getting the Cape and Singapore. There's a lot going on elsewhere. So it all, from the historical profession's point of view, it makes sense to have this parting of the ways. But of course, it is an opportunity for rethinking the possibility of bringing these things together. And if you do that, you can, I think, still continue to see the United States as part of an imperial system, at least for the first half of the 19th century, because if you go through each possible category, and I won't do it, political, economic, and cultural, you'll find that the ties between Britain and the new United States did not diminish. They expanded and became even more important than they had been before. Britain was better off without the colonies than with them. Bentham, who was smart enough character, wrote as early as 1793, when this debate was going on about gains and losses. He said, people are saying that when we lose the United States, all our trade is going to go down. Look, he said, in 1793, has it gone down? No, he said, it's increased. So if you fast forward to the 1810s, 20s, and 30s, it was becoming huge. So was finance. So was the continuation of British cultural influence. In 1837, when Emerson delivered his famous or celebrated discussion of literary independence, he was not speaking of a literary independence achieved. He was referring and reflecting on a state of dependence from which some emancipation was still needed. Now, I'm leaving out all some wonderful quotations. The agony is there, the blood is on the floor, and with the whiskey inside me, my head is swimming. The second phrase that I have is simply called, with leaden originality, modern globalization. And that is a date that runs approximately from 1850 to 1950, so we can gallop along quite nicely now. There is a certain validity to this. Modern is a very difficult word to define, but it's telling that Baudelaire, who is said to be the originator of the term modernité, was writing just around this time. And of course, Walt Whitman was writing about years of the modern in a rather different way. But from their different perspectives, they both saw that something new was taking place. And the novelty, as I describe it, is a shift, which is a familiar one. This part of the book has to be correct because it's boringly familiar. I'm just putting it, shaking the kaleidoscope and putting certain things together. This phase represents a momentous change in world history. We're so familiar with it, we take it for granted. The age-old debate and conflict, as well as complementarity between town and countryside. What we see after 1850 is an enormous shift in the power, not only economic, but political, of the land to the town, on the back of the development of manufacturing, associated politically with the demise of the dynastic state and the rise of some form of representative or constitutional government, which of course was involved in expanding the franchise and in turn placed new demands on the emerging states for the provision in some form of welfare as well as of warfare. The 1860s surely are an unprecedented decade. That is probably a big lie, but I think it was Adolf Hitler who said, if you're going to tell a big lie, tell it with all the confidence you can manage. In that decade, Germany and Italy were united for the first time. France, after the defeat at Sedan in 1870, undertook major reforms which helped to shift France, the country, in the direction I've indicated. The Austro-Hungarian Empire underwent reforms. Japan, Meiji Restoration, 1868. Even the laggardly, slow-moving British enlarged the franchise in 1867. This decade is a decade of the beginnings of profound political change. And it's no coincidence that in 1865, the United States began on exactly the same process and complemented the intention to unite the country. I won't say again, let's just say unite the country with the rapid expansion of manufacturing. Now, why should this be included in any study of empire? Gallic rhetorical question number one. Yeah, I will give you the answer and you can correct me later. The answer is because the explanation for imperialism in the late 19th century depends upon one's understanding of what kind of states and impulses there were which were propelling those forces. And the United States joined in the process of modernization, as I have crudely defined it, at exactly the same time as the other powers from the 1850s and 60s. So what you have is a profound structural transformation of economies and polities with all of the stresses and strains that we associate with that movement. In industry and politics, the whole of this period, the last quarter of the 19th century particularly, gives clear evidence of the fraught nature of this attempted transition. It's true in the whole of the continent of Europe that was participating to one degree or another. There are leaders and laggards in this. That's why the scholars refer to the alliance of wheat and rye, rye and iron in Germany and wheat and iron in France. The idea of trying to put together in some kind of coalition between established and rising forces in such a way as to hold the polity together. That's why we know of massive strikes and of labor disputes, of the formation of trade unions and so on. The United States, you will know the story from an insular perspective. The Haymarket riots, the Pullman strike in the 90s, the formation of trade unions, heavens, the formation of the first socialist movement in the late 1880s. Everything that was going on in the United States is a mirror image of what was happening in Europe at that time. So the question then becomes, what, if anything, is the relationship between these movements and the imperialism of the late 19th century? Because in something like 20 years, around from late 70s to about 1900, every part of the world that was to be colonized, or even semi-colonized in the case of China, had been fallen under that influence. Even the penguins of Antarctica by 1914 had fallen under some international division and authority. There wasn't much left. And in 1898, as you know, with the war with Spain, the United States participated in this movement and acquired an insular empire, principally in terms of population, Philippines, Hawaii in the Pacific, and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, and in the case of my own work, I've included Cuba as a very clear example of a protectorate. Now, of course, you could argue that this is a famous argument to the effect that this was an aberration, that US has a normal path of history, and you're on the road to liberty and democracy, and then suddenly there's this kind of psychic aberration, and you have this rush of blood to the head, you acquire these islands, and then you go back onto the normal path. Well, I must say that that is not a view which has many adherents now. Another view is that it takes an entirely alternative position, namely that it was a search for markets at a time of economic difficulty. That's a famous view put by Walter Lefebvre in 1969 in a wonderful book, which I think is mistaken. Because these were very poor islands. There was not even the perception that war-torn Cuba could provide markets for manufactured goods. The firms were dealing with economic difficulties of deflation and depression in the 80s and 90s, responded by reorganizing internally within the United States rather than seeking these markets. But it is possible to find a coherent explanation. And my explanation goes something like this, that what was happening in the whole of Europe, as I mentioned with regard to briefly this alliance of rye and iron and wheat and iron, that the conservative elements were searching for ways of trying to hold the polity together at a time of massive unemployment, social change of an unprecedented kind. One way of doing so was to try and bang the drum of the new sense of nationalism, and by creating bits and pieces, or in some cases, large stretches of empire. In the case of the United States, the move towards waging war in 1898 was very much a question of defending the Republican Party against the onslaught of the Democrats in the 1890s. However, so you can say that at first, initially or immediately, there was a political purpose. Behind this, however, stood a huge issue. What kind of a state was this semi-unified United States to be? Was it to be a state of free trade and silver currency, or was it to be a state of protection and gold? And the weight of business and of Wall Street fell in behind the Republican program, and the imperialist move was a way of generalizing and making national what was originally a segmented and special interest program. And if I were to look across the board at all the European countries, you will see a gradation of interest, with the British having very largely economic motives because they were so committed to overseas trade, and with right at the other end, Italy having very largely political motives, trying to unite the country in the absence of having any significant overseas financial and commercial commitments. By 1900, at least, we can be very clear that the United States had certainly achieved effective independence across the board, politically, economically. The US was penetrating British markets. Culturally, the famous commentator William Stead in 1904 said, "The old, almost pathetic humility with which American writers listened to the criticisms of Europe has disappeared." So culturally, with the vernacular, the voices of Mark Twain, of Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, you have a world culturally that is very different from that of Fenimore Cooper and Longfellow much earlier. Right. Getting there now. After 1900, with the peace that followed the war of 1898, another odd hiatus takes place. Just as the Atlantic complex, which historians of the 18th century have done so much to put in place, seems to dissipate once you get past 1783, so too the small empire acquired with such fanfare and celebration in 1898 also disappears. It is the most extraordinary omission, I think, fingers crossed, in the whole history of modern empires. The last book on ruling this empire was published in 1962 in Leiden, and the few reviews of it that I have seen mainly comment on the Dutch printers' rather poor use of understanding of English. It is actually a very fine book. We wouldn't write it like that now, but it was written with the kind of modesty that somebody of my age and clarity of expression seems to attribute to those years. I was writing myself then too, by the way. So in 1900, the empire disappears. And yet, here we have 50 years of US colonial rule, exactly the same time as the new and expanded empires of the other European powers lasted through to the 1950s and 60s. I will not go into this empire, though I would love to do so, and you may ask me about it. The first thought is, oh, it was very small and insignificant. Be careful. In 1940, the countries I've enumerated had about 24 million people. That's quite a lot of souls to be saved and bellies to be filled. And so it shouldn't be just eliminated from consideration on grounds of size. More significantly, the US empire was a microcosm of the larger European empires. Everything you see in the French and British empires is reproduced in the American empire. You have an empire of settlement, Hawaii, of concessions and plantations, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and of smallholders, largely, in the Philippines. You have methods of rule which are familiar to the British and the French, direct, indirect. You have strategies of assimilation and association. You have identical economic ties, raw materials, sugar, tobacco, and so on, going out for manufactured goods. The list goes on. Most tellingly, I think, for my story, the oscillations of this empire through time also fit exactly the oscillations of the French and British empires. From occupation 1900 to 1914, to recovery from the shocks of the First World War and a determination to hang on in the 1920s, to a real threat in the 1930s, which I think, because of the world slump, which I think really started to pull the rug from under colonial rule. And that and the reactions to it in the United States with the FDR's Brains Trust and new thinking about colonial rule is paralleled by the French and the British scratching their heads and trying to think, what have we got to do to hang on to what was still regarded as an unquestioned imperial destiny? Well, what then happened after... Ah, yes. Have I got them independent yet? Well, yes, okay. After 1945, we're still in this phase of modern globalization, the exchanges and the strategy of control. I omitted to say something terribly important, forgive me. The civilizing mission was a foundational assumption of all these empires, and it went along with the idea of racial supremacy and of technological supremacy, and it was coated with a sense of duty towards less favored people and the ambition to uplift them. So that ideology was common across the board. What happened after World War II? Again, I compress the detail here. What we know from the studies of Western European empires is that initially the victorious powers had no thought of decolonizing. The idea was, we've won the war and we'll resurrect these empires and build them up again. And the implication there was that any nationalist movement should be put down. And then after around 1955, another 10 years on, there was a change of policy towards working with the nationalists instead of against them. And this trend, which has been worked out in the case of the British and French, fits exactly with the United States, which attempted to put down the nationalist movement. And make no mistake, there was a fierce, what we would call insurgency now, with the Huks in the Philippines, who reached the gates of Manila around 1952 after a long guerrilla warfare. And the independent government of the Philippines, as it then was, required massive US assistance to defeat them. Even quiet, calm Puerto Rico had its radical nationalist in Pedro Albizu Campos, whose followers sprayed Congress with bullets in 1952. And domestically, of course, the civil rights movement at that stage, was also being monitored carefully and controlled as far as possible. And then, for reasons which I will not explain here, from about a complex of internal and geopolitical Cold War reasons, you have this beginning of a shift, so that working with the nationalists, nationalist moderates, you're looking forward, it's Batista in Cuba as he was then seen, Magsaysay in the Philippines, and so on. The idea of working with people who, if independence was already there or on the horizon, would be loyal or reasonable collaborators. Now, I now turn to the final comments that I wish to make, because these are the ones I understand you're particularly interested in. And I'll have to do these, I think, probably from the top of my now aching head. After 1945, we hit what I think is a misnomer, an oddity, at exactly the moment when the United States is decolonizing its visible territorial empire, which is exactly the same in principle as that of the other empires. Otherwise, it's losing its empire. That's when it's being called an empire, and has been off and on ever since. Now, this is not just a matter of terminology or semantics. In my view, the United States was not an empire, and it didn't become an empire. Don't throw stones yet. Whether you like it or not, this is not a matter of whether of trying in any way to diminish the role or the responsibility of the United States. It's drawing attention to the fact that the world after 1945 was not the world that had sustained the empires of the previous two phases that I have referred to, and specifically that of the previous 100 years of modern globalization. That world was changing, not immediately, but it's the world we live in today. It's a world in which economic change has shifted in such a way that the old ties between center and periphery no longer exist. It was a world in which inter-industry trade became visible by 1950. That is, the already advanced nations began to trade more with one another. North America with Europe, with soon Japan, and now, of course, China. It's a world of new organizations, such as the United Nations, an improved version, if you put it that way, of the League of Nations and its many affiliates. Initially, the United Nations was intended to speak on behalf of the victorious powers and could talk about liberation and so on without doing anything. But after a while, with more and more independent countries joining the United Nations, it became a voice of what was seen to be the oppressed or the deprived. And that was very important in the battle for the hearts and minds of men and women, he added, during this period, especially with the competition with the Soviet Union moving from a Cold War to a phase of competitive coexistence. And that draws our attention to another major change, and that is the way in which what you might call world morality was altering. It wasn't just a question of new countries wanting civil rights internally, as you would understand it in the United States, and as it happened in the United States, essentially the vote and so on. It was a question of wanting human rights Human rights are rights which are broader than civil rights. The right to be treated on a basis of equality, the right to welfare, the right to education. Now, those things were profound because they cut away at the notion that there was a superior race or culture and in sets of inferior ones without obscuring differences. And that was a profound moral change of the like of which has not taken place before. And there was one final change, and that is what we would call in the business the Green Uprising. Not the Green Revolution, that's wheat and India. The Green Uprising refers to the movement of colonial nationalist organizations away from constitutional urban elite politics to extend their range to the mass of the population, the peasantry, and then further down into the workers of the towns. And this was happening, this Green Uprising was happening on a massive scale after 1945. Gandhi, of course, was there earlier, and you might say that Jackson taking over from Adams in the 1820s marks such a shift in the nature of politics in the US. But after World War II, you had motor transport, radios, telephones, newspapers in the colonies. The possibilities technically in terms of communication of enlarging the political base were again transformed. These changes, and many others I haven't mentioned, profoundly altered the nature of modern globalization that I described, and they made it impossible, or also they made empires of the kind I've talked about impossible, unworkable, or redundant. They were quite irrelevant. So the United States was not an empire in my terms after 1945, although it was, of course, a huge, major, influential power. I would go on to say, and I'm sure you wish to ask me about this, that the only term I can find, and I've borrowed it from international relations people, it's most unsatisfactory, is to refer to the United States as a hegemon. And that is unsatisfactory because a hegemon, depending on who you're reading, can cover somebody who can exercise his persuasive powers, but also somebody who can be coercive. So, you know, everything is in there, but still, it is a term that differentiates the United States from the empires, its predecessors, and indeed from its own history. And I would also argue that if you look across the world, you'll find that this hegemon was an aspiring hegemon and not an entirely successful one. Even during the period 1945 to 70s, between Bretton Woods and devaluation, at a time when Germany, France, and the Allies were flat on their backs, still recovering, there were serious limitations to the extent to which the United States could get its way. And if we look across the world at the plenty of intervention, lots of coup and interference with politics, but the net result was at best to achieve a short-term geopolitical advantage in the battle with the Soviet Union, but that is entirely different from a set of empires which seek to integrate the periphery with the center for the purposes that I have outlined. And I'm now going to finish, you'll be glad to know, but I want to finish with a bang if I can find a sufficient bullet. Yes. And the problem with evaluating the recent past is that, of course, being our past, we exaggerate its importance. And so our past, our memorable past, seems to us to occupy what we can compress without thinking about it, several centuries of going back some. And I think there's a danger of what's been called presentism, of exaggerating not only our own role, but of many of the things that strike us rightly as being of huge importance. You'll remember, some of you, the 1980s, when the United States was supposed to be in decline suddenly, because of the a rising power of Japan and so on. And then in '89, the Berlin Wall fell down, and so Japan fell by the wayside. It was all changed, and we had the 1990s, a mood of triumphalism. We can do anything. Well, we're going to have a unipolar moment. We're a superpower. We can just tell other people what to do. Well, what happened to that? We got into Iraq, and one disaster followed another, and we have, with our genius, sowed the seeds of discontent, not just for the morrow, but for generations to come there. Put yourself in the place of an 11-year-old growing up in Syria or in Iraq, and rightly or wrongly, ask yourself, what are that child's chances, or what are his or her chances of looking benignly upon the influence of the West, as well as of those also committing bad things around them. So when the unipolar moment came, all things, it was said, were in the grasp of men of action and of imperfect vision. Rarely has nemesis followed hubris so swiftly or decisively. Yet hegemons are reluctant to abandon their illusions. Aspirations become more precious as the prospect of attaining them recedes. In this matter, as in so many others since the 18th century, the US and the UK continue to move in complementary fashion. Making America great again is echoed distantly in Brexit. Yet the age of great empires has passed, which shows that the nostalgia for hegemony is in reality evidence of the hegemony of nostalgia. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. I think this took us from the 18th century to the very present, and that is, of course, quite impressive, and we would like to challenge you, of course, about it. There are many people here who would like to challenge you, and I would like to challenge you a little bit about the notion that there wasn't anything like an American empire. And as you know, in the literature, everyone agrees, of course, the American empire was not just like the British or the French or whatever other empires there were, or even the Roman Empire, but it was maybe a benign empire, an informal empire, an empire by invitation, and other nice phrases which have been coined. And somehow, let's say, empire by invitation or benign empire, they don't sound wrong to me. Why do you think they're entirely wrong?
Yes, okay, thank you. Is my microphone still on?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, excellent questions to get me started and tied in knots. I would say that all empires have thought of themselves as being benign and altruistic. So it's rather a self-indulgence for us to presume whichever country we're standing in is rather unique in that respect. Much the same as exceptionalism. There are exceptionalist myths in Britain, France, Russia, Japan, and everywhere you look in a country that has had any kind of power pretensions. I think that the fact that some of the commentators that you rightly mention have had to qualify the term empire with an empire of invitation, that I think is simply the smiling face of dominance, so to speak, or an empire by invitation and so on, means that they want to have their cake and eat it. They're using the term, but they want to attach a qualification or an expansion of it. Just think what the implications are if you don't grasp the nettle and choose another word. If you're calling it an empire, that then legitimates comparison with other empires. You have to have two to make a comparison. Now, that is why we have all these books, Are We the New Rome? And trying to make these vast comparisons in which you pick selectively the 2 or 3 things they have in common, you know, won't go into it, it's obvious enough, but that structurally they're fundamentally different. And I think all of these examples, which are excellent ones, of the way in which very smart historians and others have sought to describe the United States while feeling lost if they lose the word empire, is just an indication of the difficulties of fitting the US structure and experience into that of the empires I have described.
Thanks very much. As you know, there's a very famous question in the literature: why has there never been a proper socialism in the United States? And a lot of questions and answers are being given about that. So let me ask you, why has there then never been a proper empire in the United States? Why has the United States not developed that empire culture as the British, the French, the Germans, and whoever did?
Yes, that's another good question. Well, a very simple answer is that the United States, a very simple and inadequate answer, but a part contribution to an answer, is that the United States arrived in 1898 fairly late into the game. Much of the world was already in process of being colonized. There was still scope, but you know, you soon get to the penguins of the Antarctic. And a more important explanation, I think, is the sheer vastness and opportunity within the United States itself. Turner talked about the closing of the frontier, a famous lecture in 1892. But of course, you fast forward a decade and that frontier was opening up again. And then when you get motor cars around First World War and so on, it opened up more. And so it has been continuously through to refrigeration and air conditioning down in North Carolina and in the further south. So all of these frontiers within the United States have constantly opened up throughout the 20th century. And that, I think, is the principal explanation. The United States, by destiny, shall we say, manifest or otherwise, fell upon an extraordinarily rich continent. If you compare the resources to those in Canada, I'm speaking historically, because of course the mineral resources of Canada are those which have been mineable only relatively recently, or South America, or Australia. You know, there is no comparison. You guys struck it lucky and rich, yes. So I think that internal explanation is quite a strong one.
Thank you. Let me ask you a final question before I open it up. Maybe a question which also has something to do with the present and the future. Yeah. You said quite rightly that we are too focused on our old times, over-exaggerate its importance. So how important is the Donald?
How is the
Donald Trump.
Well, now you are tempting me to go beyond my modest role as a historian, and as I can put it this way, that historians are poorly paid to understand the past. Some social scientists are highly paid to misunderstand the future. So I think that my prophecy is worth everything you've paid for it. So I think that it's a very fascinating question, because, of course, we all wish to reduce uncertainty and to know where we're going. So the premium on producing a soundbite that fits the mood of the moment and appears to have, as they used to say and may still have, legs, is a huge reward in kudos and money. But there books have been written about these predictions, by the way, and the record is totally abysmal. And if you think of one of the great public intellectuals of our time in your country, that is Francis Fukuyama, and then you see he was a triumphalist in the 1990s, the end of history, which he meant was all ideology is finished, there's only one thing left and it's us. And that fitted the mood of the moment. Then, of course, he left the neocons, and so he got into declinism and so on. The problem is that most of these predictions fit together 2 points from a relatively short period of time. So if you're drawing your points from a moment, a decade, shall we say, that's a moment for historians of optimism, you go up there. If you then draw your 2 points from 2008, after a few years, you go down there, and declinism is back in vogue and so on. All these things are short term, but our need for them is such that we can't resist buying them. Now, historians are not in that game. What we can do is approximately to draw the parameters of likely human action. Well, that's no good for politicians, or how would that go down with one of your TV programs where you want a clickety-click soundbite about the future? So unfortunately, I am condemned to be a poorly paid historian.
Well, the next book seems to be in the making here. Thanks very much. Open it up to questions from you. Who would like to ask the first question? Okay, this gentleman, briefly.
Do you agree with Dane Kennedy's concept that America is a quote-unquote hyperpower?
Yeah, it's not, thank you. I was with Dane Kennedy just yesterday. And had you had the foresight to ask your question, I could have asked it to him and reported to you. Yeah, it's not his term, by the way. It's not his term. The term hyperpower is around in the international relations literature, and he, among others, has picked it up. I don't know what it means. It came into vogue towards the close of that period of triumphalism in the 1990s, and it was indicative that some term was needed to describe the United States as being a power like none other before it, and it linked up with that phrase that I mentioned of the unipolar moment. That is to say, we are supreme, we can do what we want. And of course, you don't hear so much about that today. And I think it links with the notion, the perception, rightly or wrongly, that this unipolar moment has passed, if it ever existed, and so did the hyperpower concept, that you're then into the last presidential election and the need to make America great again. And a very similar thing, rather more pathetically, in the British with Brexit, as I mentioned. This is a search for an age that never really existed as it exists in the minds of those who are moved by it. It's a sad thing, but inevitable, that when you get to a certain age, you look back on when you were young, so that objectively, even though those times might have been of slump or world war or something, somehow you conjure out of that period when you were young, smiling, vital, and so on, a time that was superb in all its ways, when character was formed, there was hope for the world, and so on and so on. There's a lot of that in these notions of making America great again, and also of Brexit.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your talk. I appreciate it very much. Following up on your last comment, so you would say what Trump and May are doing in Make America Great Again.
I can't hear you very well.
Oh, sorry. You're saying that they're not actually literally being reactionary because there was no empire in America, but there was one in Britain, but that they are being isolationist and protectionist, trying to reestablish something that never existed.
No, you're asking me to talk about current policies?
Well, I'm just following up on your comment how Trump's Make America Great Again and May's Brexit, as far as I could tell, you're saying were equally idiotic, but that technically, since the U.S. Didn't have an empire, from your point of view, it's not reactionary. In England, perhaps, it is a reactionary stance. Is it isolationist? Is it protectionist, what they're both doing?
I just can't get my mind around that. I didn't use the word idiotic, by the way.
Oh, I did.
I think that one has to take these movements very seriously. They are profound, and they tell us something about society and how it views its present and its future. And if the future doesn't look so good, it's inclined to look back into the past. Now, in this case, the content of making the United States great again and the content of making Britain great again are rather different, because the British, when they look back, inevitably don't go very far without thinking of this huge empire that they ran for 200 or 300 years. And the United States doesn't look back on the Philippines at all, let alone with those thoughts. But the United States does look back to a period when it seemed to be greater than I would argue it was, but that is where the United States appeared to dominate the world after 1945. So it's not strictly, in my terms, an imperial nostalgia, right? But it is a nostalgia about a great power which seems to have fallen from a high point as perceived by those reflecting on it today.
Thank you very much. Lloyd Kramer?
Yeah, I wanted to raise 2 points. One, it seemed to me that your basic argument is to reject the ideology of American exceptionalism because every point you made tried to link America to Europe. And American exceptionalism is one of the key themes of American nationalism. I wanted to ask you about that. And secondly, it seemed to me that you missed the key parallel in empire building, which would not be Britain or France, but would be Russia, because the United States was basically a land-based empire that started along the Atlantic. They drove the British out and then took over the imperial project, going into Florida, into Louisiana, then on to driving out the Mexicans. So in fact, it was a very successful land-based imperial expansion where territory was systematically taken from Indians, Mexicans, and people who had been living there before. What makes it any different from other empires in that respect?
Well, that was excellent questions. I'm sorry to say that at my age, you're going to have to repeat them one by one, but succinctly, just cue me in. But while you're thinking of doing that, may I say that you can't criticize me too much because, and I'm very delighted that you're here, and I want to meet you afterwards because your own work is cited, not in this context, with great approval and acclaim in several of my many footnotes. So now,
well, I think the book is brilliant then, but thank you for being here. I was trying.
No, the first one was about exceptional. No, just do it for me again.
No, I was just trying to make 2 points. One, that you're rejecting the ideology of American exceptionalism on the one hand, and secondly,
okay, we'll do that.
That you're
Yeah.
okay.
So the problem in rejecting the ideology of American exceptionalism, I'm not quite sure what the significance of that is because this is not a term or a concept that many professional historians would work with today, and I'm rather proud of myself that I dealt with it in a page because the temptation is, of course, go on and on about it. What mattered to me was to try to find some alternative way, which was could not be conceived of in any sense of trying to put the United States down, because, as I argue throughout the book, many facets that I'm drawing attention to are actually underestimated in all the standard books. The point I made, for example, about the first half of the 19th century, had our chair permitted me the extra hour or two I wanted, I would have given you some wonderful quotations from Henry Clay and Henry Carey and Frederick List, who was also in the US in the 1820s. Their very self-consciousness of how the need for politics was really to try to get a system that would create a genuine independence. They used the language. William Seward in 1853 referred to the War of Independence as being the first act of decolonization in this great continent of ours. The first act. He saw this. So the whole point of the chapter or two that I have there is to establish an alternative and to say explicitly, in this one example, to say explicitly that scholars need to turn to this period because there they have the first example of a major newly independent state struggling with these issues of how to reconcile liberty with economic development, how to create a new polity that was to be stable, and so on and so on. And it's a wonderful case study which has not been seen in that light. So through the book, I try to draw attention to the novel features which my alternative argument, I hope, is worthwhile considering. And your second point, Russia. Well, that's a very good and very big question. Of course, there is an aspect, a huge aspect of US empire building, or I prefer to say imperialism, as you did, which I haven't considered here. I have it in chapter 5 or 50, so there's a chapter about this. But my problem is that I'm trying to look at the US from the perspective of international relations, and I've got to be careful about how far I go into US history, because I can't cross swords or even run alongside the many great scholars who have spent their lives studying West Virginia during 1 year of the Civil War. I mean, it's all wonderful stuff, but I can't cope with that, and I'm stretched anyway, and I don't want to get too far. So I have drawn some kind of a line there, but I've looked at the big wars of the period from exactly the point of view that you've mentioned, and of course the Native American wars as well, because the analogy there is with other settler societies, and this is another point that is not frequently in the books with the emphasis it should have. The westward movement in the 19th century is treated very much as if it's sui generis. It's just relating to the United States. But if you think a bit bigger about settler societies, exactly the same thing was going on in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa at about the same time, with different results and outcomes, a fascinating comparison. So I just touch on that. As for Russia, well, of course, they are both continental, that is to say, land-based, imperialist, I would say, impulses. I agree with you entirely. But there's a difference between an imperialism of intent and an imperialism of result. That is to say, the imperialism of intent can lead to several results. One is the creation of an empire. The other could be, for instance, the creation of a nation state. And I think there are profound differences between the Russian and US cases on many grounds, constitutional grounds. There were semi-autonomous regions within the Russian Empire. Depends what dates we're talking to. Let's go down to 1917. But there were also areas that were permanently run by provincial governors, some of whom were called viceroys. There's a huge difference in the ratio of settlers to local peoples, if I put it that way. In the case of Native Americans, the numbers were smallish and getting smaller through the 19th century. In the case of Russian ethnic groups in the move east, you're talking of millions of people. And there was no real expansion of settlement from the western part of Russia till after 1905, when admittedly several million people moved that way, but they were still dwarfed by the indigenous inhabitants. I won't go on about this, I'm no great expert, but what I would agree with you is that there is a similarity of movement and intent and a colonizing, literally colonizing process, but the outcomes were different. In the end, through territorial government in the United States, you had states which had a constitutional parity one with another. And that was not the case in the case of Russia.
Thank you very much indeed for this very exhaustive answer. I think we all will have to read the book and not just the footnotes. Any more questions? Yes, please.
Hi, I was just wondering, you mentioned that after 1955, America was being classified as an empire, even though you would argue it was not an empire, correct?
Oh, I said approximately after World War II, let's put that.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Do you think that was because of the decolonization movements in Africa, in Asia, and stuff like that, this hypercriticism of empires of the past, such as the British Empire, the French Empire, especially in West Africa? Do you think because of this movement to extract colonial powers that people became focused with American intervention and called it an empire, even if it wasn't technically, in your perspective, an empire after World War II?
I think there is something in that. It's an oddity of the literature that there are lots of books with titles, United States and Decolonization. There are lots of books with that kind of title, and then after the colon, there'll be something like US diplomacy towards Algeria. There is nothing that talks, well, very little, that talks about this with respect to the US empire. There was a kind of empire in denial, because it was very small, as I say, and the Cold War and so on was very big. So that was one shift. The other curious, and I'm glad you asked this question, the other curious aspect of the literature, which I have dealt with, though, in very superficial, compressed way, is that the United States was the only major power with a territorial empire that actually had to grapple with what the literature calls internal decolonization. And this is, of course, the civil rights movement and the Native American movement. And as an outsider, one of the oddities of that literature is the way in which they're in two compartments. And if you're coming at it from the outside, you tend to see these as moving in parallel, even though they were like ships in the night that didn't actually signal one another. And that's what the literature has done. But I think it's quite useful to put them together as one broad movement. That's to say, not one in a united sense, but one movement in terms of understanding its characteristics. I would conclude on that note by saying I do think that the literature on what we call decolonization has to be transformed in the future. And it's partly because it's not just that we got to bring the US small empire into the story. And I'm hoping that what I and others are doing will enable this to be taught a little bit. It's also because we need to think big about decolonization. We should include, for example, parts of the British dominions like Australia and Canada, which although they had self-government 1867, 1901, nevertheless were still effectively in terms of trade and culture and politics very much and willingly dependent upon the British. And if you look at when they began to gain effective independence, you come right to this period, the 50s, 60s, 70s. Look at the transformation that those countries have experienced in that time. And then if you go to somewhere like China, which I think is crucial, there's a very good case for saying that China was something minimally of a semi-colony since the revolution of 1911, foreign interference and so on, the treaty ports and all the rest of it. And that the revolution of 1949 was very much part of a nationalist anti-colonial movement. If you broaden it like that, you'll see that by taking a perspective of globalization of all of the ideas and changes that I referred to, the notion of decolonization studies, which confines itself to the formal colonies in Africa and Asia, has got to be greatly enlarged.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Are there any ideas or concepts in your book that you think current policymakers could use prospectively?
Could use?
Prospectively. In other words, use your ideas somehow to do something in the future.
Yes, of course. Well, of course I would like to say yes, because I follow and quote Ibn Khaldun, who thought that history was an indispensable aid to excellence in ruling. If you don't know how you got from there to here, you have only a shaky basis for looking towards the future, would be the kind of argument. But as I said earlier, it's not given to historians to produce the sound bites that are necessary for politics. We can only give a shape to the possibilities.
Well, an idea or concept is more than just a soundbite.
Sorry?
An idea or concept is more than a soundbite.
Yes, of course it is. But the question is, would anyone want to listen to such a thing? They want it broken down. I find it paradoxical that the United States has probably the most numerous intellectual powerhouses in the world. And yet, and I must be careful here, when you look at US policy, foreign policy, you don't always see some of the findings, the learning, the refinement, the approaches, the concepts, if you like, which could become ingredients to foreign policy, being utilized. And various recent appointments of people who distinguished themselves, if that's the right word, during the time of the Iraq War by their own concepts and attitudes, does not really seem to indicate that any lessons of history have been learned whatsoever. And of course, historians will debate the lessons of history, but at least there should be an informed debate And when that doesn't happen, you're just flying on ideology.
Thank you. We may have time for a couple of more questions. There's one over here.
Tony, rather than the decline and the disappearance of the American empire, could you not perhaps argue that it's never been greater? Look at our economic McDonald's, IBM, Microsoft, all these all over the world. And so the nature of our empire is different, but we are perhaps a greater force than we ever were.
Well, you can make that colonization is the phrase that's been used to describe that, but that's nothing, it may not be anything to do with empire. It may, but it may not. It's not necessarily a symptom of empire, it's a symptom of successful expanding business. So one has to be careful about linking that to empire. And of course, we can cite many examples, actually Pepsi-Cola is one that comes to mind, of how the Indian government said, told them what to do. So, and books have been written about the multinationals or the transnationals in Latin America, indicating that the branch offices become domesticated. They've become, in your terms, so successful that they've sunk capital. They've got relations with the local labor force. So they actually they become domesticated, house-trained. So they represent to head office the local needs and say, we've got to fit in with this otherwise, so that with your McDonald's burger, you can have a werewolf burger, or you make a point of having all local ingredients and so on. So this nature of globalization is a kind of joint product, really. And I don't think it's right necessarily to see it as the dependency theorists saw it in the 1970s. And there was a wonderful book with an octopus on the cover, and you look round it and the tentacles were going round like that. And that was a symbol of the multinational corporations squeezing the third world. No, that's one view, but it's not, I think, one that can stand without considerable qualification.
Right, maybe, yeah, that's a question.
What implications should we draw from your argument today in regards to how the United States will accommodate China as the rising power?
Yes, okay. Well, I would, look, I've already given you an answer to that. I'm a historian. I'm not going to give you policy advice unless you pay me an awful lot of money. Then I can produce instant advice and put it across fairly convincingly, depending on the size of the check. But this is what I call a saloon bar answer. Two guys who know nothing get together in the pub and they ask about this. So, all right. There is something very strange about the United States. It goes back to the Illuminati in the late 18th century, this sense that the world is conspiring against them. Hence poor Cuba, of course, which is seen to be a constant threat. The rest of the world regards this as bizarre. So so then it sort of now starts, or has started actually since the turn of the century, with much greater weight to figure China as the great threat. And depending on your view of this, and it seems that we can't tell what your current president view is of this, though it doesn't seem to be perhaps as well informed as it might be, do you take a tough line on the grounds that, if they gain, we're going to lose, or do you try and develop a form of smart diplomacy where you recognize the power and interests of other people and work out how to accommodate yourself to them on the assumption, which I would hold, that there's never been a unipolar moment except in the most exceptional cases of after World War II briefly, but even then it wasn't the case because it was a Soviet Union. So if you work on the assumption that all power has always been multi-power, multipolar, then China's coming along as one more entrant into this game, and we need to do some smart thinking about how to do the negotiation and all this stuff about trade wars and so on. It seems to me to be quite extraordinary and quite totally unrealistic. And I can understand why it's being done. And the Chinese, I think, are being very smart in their response. It's so easy to underestimate other people when you are yourself a very big country. You have to remember that all these guys in the Middle East who have small countries and the guys in China who have one very big country have endless centuries of subtle diplomacy with their neighbors, with their contiguous states. There is an attitude of mind, an experience of diplomacy that perhaps is not always present in the United States, which has been historically a very large power surrounded by very minor powers. And the lessons of history, as I said, in recent times have not always been learned, sadly. So I don't know what will happen any more than anyone else does. I would like to see an intelligent appraisal of the rising power of China before we go on and worry ourselves stiff about India, and which will come next, no doubt. Whether that will happen or not, I would not bet on it at the moment.
Thank you very much indeed. I think these are good words to finish the evening. And you mentioned an intelligence appraisal. I think that book does provide lots of intelligent appraisals. So thank you very much, Tony Hopkins, for coming. Has been a pleasure. The book is outside, and I would like to tell you also that our last event for this semester is next Monday. That is an event on China and the United States, particularly about trade relations towards China. So the trade war will feature, and I think both speakers view it critically, but you're very welcome. It's a speaker from the Trade Representative's office in Washington who actually deals with Trump's China policy and trade policy, and a guy from Shanghai who, of course, is very close to the action. So please come back next Monday, and thank you, Tony Hopkins, again for coming here. A great pleasure.
Hi.